Good morning, EXJW community. Thank you so much for tuning in to another edition of my vlog. As I said in another video, I was going to do a better job of having videos where I talked about timely subjects and things that I think would benefit the ex-Jehovah Witness and Jehovah Witness community as a whole. I'm drinking tea this morning. For a spot of tea, I wanted everyone to join us. I have a terrible English accent, so I'm not going to try and do it. But today is more of a story time subject. It also may be a triggering subject for some people, so I'm going to put a bit of a disclaimer before I get into it. I'm not going to do too much of an introduction. If there are people, and this is your first time ever listening to a video of mine and you want to know about the Oracle, please go to my very first video called The Awakening. And I do a little snippet from the Matrix. Quick little tidbit is that we are living in a matrix. I may get into that sometime in the future, but I just wanted to sort of get into why I was motivated to do the video that I'm doing today and the title of the video. So the title of the video is Why I Decided to Forgive My Jehovah Witness Grandmother. And one of the reasons that I decided to do this video is because there was no more important relationship I had with any female in my life than my maternal grandmother. For many years, she was my very best friend, and the tragic change in our relationship was totally and completely because of the Jehovah Witness cult. And there were so many other things that came out in my life regarding my grandmother, regarding my grandfather, regarding my family, that by the time that my grandmother transitioned, I had to, in myself, find a way to make peace with it and make peace with what had happened in my life, what had happened in the relationship I had with my grandmother, how being in a Jehovah Witness cult affected me. And the reason that I wanted to share it with the group, because some of it is very personal, some of it is very emotional to me, but I have in the past year and a half communicated with people that have watched my videos. And the reason why I do my videos the way that I do them is because I am a very philosophical, humanistic person. And my reason for doing my videos and talking to people was to talk to what you go through in your family, in yourself. How do you get resolution? I really try to come from more of a psychological and empowering method of talking to the people that listen to me. And a lot of times when you have a similar background like mine, where you have been raised in this religion for generations, people have been Jehovah Witnesses, and you leave the religion for whatever reason, you leave on your own accord, you got disfellowship, you disassociated, you faded away, and your relationship changed with your immediate family or your grandparents, when they pass away, it's going to affect you. And I have talked to so many ex-Jehovah Witnesses that have gone through that, are going through that. Their parents are very sick and they're having to deal with, I am shunned from my family, but now all of the things that happened to me, good, bad, and indifferent, are coming to the surface. And how do I deal with that? How do I make peace with that? Because it will come up and you will have to deal with it so that it doesn't overcome you. Because still in my first videos, when I was trying to find my stride on how I was actually going to do videos, I sort of went through this trying to be kind of cathartic when I was sharing my story, and I was talking about, you know, all the different things that happened with me towards my family, that there is no one way that your family is going to react when you leave the religion. Most of the time they will 100% shun you, but there are times when your family members, especially your older family members, may be a little bit different. So let's get into it. I first wanted to I wanted to start with the very last conversation I had with my grandmother. I called my grandmother. I knew she was sick. And it was a very endearing conversation. I hadn't seen my grandmother for probably about a year. And I really had wanted to see my grandmother, but she had started to fall very, very ill. And I would know from a family member that would let me know that, the health of my grandmother. So I really was doing my best to get up to see my grandmother, but she was getting really, really sick, and it was the winter time, and I was having difficulty with work and all of those things, getting a chance to drive up to see my grandmother with the roads not being good. So I called my grandmother and I talked to her, and it was a very sweet conversation. My grandmother, I have a nickname that most of the people in my family call me and have called me since I was a little girl. And it's this very sweet, endearing name. And my grandmother called me that. And she told me how much she missed me. And it was really interesting to hear her talk, because she said, people in the family say things about you, but I don't listen to that. And I knew exactly who my grandmother was talking about, because one of my aunts and I think her son have, repeatedly would say very negative things about me. And my cousin one time was like, why does our cousin continually say these negative things about you, call you crazy? And I'm like, I have no idea, because I honestly haven't talked to this person since they were 8. And the only thing that I can say is because they're bitter, evil people, or they're messed up because of the cult that they're in. I don't actually care. It's like, I don't talk to these people. I don't associate with these people. It's kind of like when I went on the radio show, and I talked about this in one of my videos, and I, was talking to people that had left cults and how their family treated them. And I was talking about how I was discussing with a Hasidic Jew who had left his belief system, and he lived in a very close-knit community. Even though he had left the community in New York, he would still come across some of his family, and he was like, some of his cousins would throw shoes at him. And I was like, yeah, I've heard through the grapevine, if you will, that there's like, most of my family, even though they shunned me, never was rude to me or disrespectful to me. They would, I talked about the aunt that one time I saw my aunt and she ignored me completely. I was with my stepmother. My father had sent something to me via my stepmother. I ran into my aunt with my stepmother. My aunt, who I've known my entire life, absolutely ignored me. But that same aunt, many years later, when I was at a funeral, grabbed me for like 3 minutes, because a friend of mine that was with me took the picture. And this same aunt held me for 3 minutes and kept saying over and over again, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. So I've experienced both sides of it. And I want to say for the record that the reason why you get irrational behavior from your family and that it can be up and down is because shunning your family members that you love is not natural. And I think it's such cognitive dissonance with the people that are actually in the organization. When they come across a family member, sometimes they feel like they have to attack them personally and say things about them to justify their behavior. And then other times they're nice to you. And I think it's because they themselves are like, this person has actually never done anything to me. Or I haven't seen this person in my adulthood. I haven't seen this person for 25 years. It's like, what could they possibly be talking about? They have never had a connection with me and talk to me in my adulthood at all. I actually, if I got pulled over, I was in court, I would have to say, I don't know. I don't have a relationship with this person. I don't know this person at all. So they're someone who cannot attest to my character whatsoever. So you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. But before I get into what I want to get into, I want to make one more statement. And this is just something that I realized in myself. And that is, I lost more family members than I ever imagined. It was a very difficult time for me a couple of years ago. I lost my brother. And I'm just going to call out my brother's name because it doesn't matter. I lost my brother, David. Um, it was the single most devastating thing in my life that ever happened to me. And then I lost my paternal grandmother, who I loved. I wasn't as close to her as I was to my maternal grandmother, but it was very hard for me. I went to my paternal grandmother's funeral. I hadn't seen my mother in a while, and something just told me that I wasn't going to see my mother again. She died six months after that. So in a period of about a year and a half, I had lost my brother, I had lost my grandmother, and I had lost my mother. And then after that, my paternal grandfather died, and then my maternal grandmother died. And this is the person that I am talking about in this video. But so I went through a lot. There's no way for me to even cover the devastation that I went through and how losing so many people that had such a huge impact on my life changed me. And the fact that they were all connected to the Jehovah Witness organization in one way or another. And it made me think about my relationship. I went to funerals and hadn't set foot in the Kingdom Hall in many, many years. And the way that I saw so many people that I had grew up with, it was almost overwhelming for me. And I had different experiences at the funerals. But the one thing that I need to get out before I get into how I forgave my grandmother, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our background and our story, is that when they pass on, the one thing that makes the most impact on you is the love. Love is stronger than anything that anybody can tell you, any petty thing that people talk about. Because when my brother died, I had not talked to my brother in a while, but I love my brother more than anything on the planet. And when my brother passed away, that is all that mattered. All the stupid stuff that we as humans hold on to in our life makes no difference. And if there's nothing else that you get from what I'm sharing, it's like this organization and the things that they, force their members to do, it's not based on love. because I loved my family. I loved my brother. I loved my grandparents. I loved my mom. You know, like when my maternal grandmother died, and I thought about all the things that we have went through in our life and my journey, and this woman being the most important woman in my life, even more than my own mother, and thinking about the journey of our relationship and me coming to terms with forgiving her after everything that I had found out is probably one of the most important paths, important resolutions I've had in my life. And that's why I'm sharing it, because let me tell you, if you're like me, if you have parents, if you have grandparents, if you have children that pass on and they've never resolved things with you, or you've had to kind of go through the shunning, then you're going to have to find a way to make peace with it. Because all that really matters is the love, and you can take that with you. It doesn't matter what anyone else says. They can't touch your specific personal journey with that person, and you can't focus on it. So I want to talk a little bit about my personal interaction with my grandmother. I want to talk about the relationship that I had with my grandmother and my parents after I got this fellowship. And then I'm just going to go back to the beginning. And this is just sort of to explain to people. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the story resolution, so that I just continue talking until I get to sort of the end of the story. So when I got this fellowship, my situation is not going to be like everyone's. My father had been disfellowshipped quite a few times in my life. In fact, until I was about 23, my father really wasn't a Jehovah Witness most of my life, up until I was about 23, 24. So my father wasn't the Jehovah Witness baptized person. He carried the beliefs with him. And like I tell people now, he's an elder. I'm going to do a whole, like big video on my father, because I think it's not enough time in one video to talk about it. And I don't want to detract, but my mother has always been a Jehovah Witness. But and my grandparents as well. My grandfather my paternal grandfather was disfellowshipped a few times before I was born, but ever since I was born, my grandfather has been a devout Jehovah Witness, although he had been disfellowshipped so many times and had an issue with alcoholism that he was never anything more than would go to the Kingdom Hall and would go out in field service. On my maternal side, my grandmother was a devout Jehovah Witness. She auxiliary pioneered, and my grandfather was a presiding overseer for a large portion of my young life. So when I got disfellowshipped, it literally didn't matter. None of my parents or grandparents on either side didn't talk to me. The relationship changed dramatically for my grandparents, but I was never 100% shunned by them, meaning I could walk to my grandparents' house, to my parents' house, and knock on the door. They would let me in and they would talk to me. But the relationship was significantly different. I did not interact with them that often. But I was never completely shunned by them. But I didn't go for family dinners. There was a lot of things that I didn't do. I just talked to them occasionally. Now with my father and my stepmother has always been a witness, except for when my father first married her. And I'll share that whole story, because she was my father's mistress for a long time before they actually got married. And she caused well, she and my father caused my mother to have her first nervous breakdown, but that's a whole another conversation. But my stepmother never didn't talk to me when I was disfellowshipped because she was married to my father, who had been disfellowshipped twice with her when they were married. So, but there were differences. There were lots of differences. I think the biggest thing that I remember is that my grandparents had a 50th anniversary party. Both sets of my grandparents did, and I wasn't invited to that. And I had to hear about it from, various family members who talked about how wonderful it was. And, one of my aunts and uncle are like really fantastic dancers. They used to be swing dancers back in the day. And I heard about, how they put on this performance and everything. And, I wasn't there to see it. And I remember hearing about it, and it was, quite sad, to hear about, my family members having, celebrations and things like that. And I was not involved in it. But they never 100% shunned me. If I wanted to call and see how everybody was doing, they would talk to me. My parents, my mother never shunned me. I didn't talk to my mother because she had mental illness and she would attack me and tell lies on me and try and humiliate me with stories from when I was a kid. But it was never about my mother, like, I can't talk to you because you're not a witness. So I just kind of want to put that disclaimer out before I start telling my story. So let's go back in time. I have always had a wonderful relationship with my maternal grandmother. I am the oldest granddaughter. My brother David was the oldest grandson. So we got to know my grandparents when they were still fairly young. My parents got married when they were 18 years old. So my grandparents, looking at it now, my grandparents weren't too much older than, what I am today. So they were still fairly young when my mother had us. So, when I was young, my grandmother was still working full time and my grandfather was still working full time. But because my mother was so young, I was always around my grandmother and grandfather. My grandmother and grandfather actually lived exactly around the corner from us. So from the age of when I started talking till I was 9 years old, I actually used to call my maternal grandparents, grandmom and grandpop, around the corner. Kids make up different things. So I literally saw my grandparents every single day. And I really had a great relationship with my grandmother. We were great friends. And I was a very precocious kid. I, was very headstrong. So and I was bad. I have no problem admitting that, but when I say I was bad, I was just, I wasn't the kid that you could, just sit and give them a toy or a coloring book and they were just going to do it. No, you actually had to really, watch me. You had to, I was one who had my own mind. When I was finally tested, when I think I was in the second grade, and they were like, no, actually, she's actually really, really intelligent. You have to give her certain things in order to keep her mind occupied. My mom and, some of my other family members understood it's not that she's this terribly, bad person or, bad kid or bad seed or dark child. It's just that she has her own way of doing things. And that's one of the reasons that when I first started studying psychology, I wanted to be a child psychologist, because I understood when you misidentify intelligent, gifted children. And my husband and I talk about these type of things because he's an educator, and he has like 2 masters in written books and stuff like that. But when you talk to kids that are special in terms of whether they're autistic or they're gifted, sometimes you see that public schools sometimes don't know how to deal with gifted children, and they don't know how to give them the right tools that they need. And especially when they're young, they're going to go through some of the same things, because my husband is also identified as a gifted child, and when he was young, he went through some of the same things I did with family members until they found someone who actually understood how to communicate with them. And my grandmother was one of those people who actually never had an issue communicating with me, and never had an issue talking to me about different things. And one of the things I loved about my grandmother was her stories. So I'm a published writer, and I started writing because I was imitating my grandmother when she would tell stories. I thought being a grandmother was the greatest thing ever. And my grandmother had this great ability to make everybody feel special. She had a lot of children, she had a lot of grandchildren, but she made every single child, every single grandchild, from this is my own personal experience, feel special. And that takes a great gift. And I honestly think that my grandmother and I were much more alike than I realized. Now, when I think about it, my grandmother was very regimented. She was very family oriented. She was very devoted to whatever she was a part of. But she understood me at an early age, and she understood that I loved stories. She understood that I liked scheduled things. Like, she would tell me, this is what we're going to do now. This is, if you do this, you'll earn this. And so me mimicking my grandmother, I used to tell stories when I was in school, and then the stories became things that I would write. And that was how I began to develop my writing ability, but it was me mimicking my grandmother. So she was my, usher to the world, because my grandmother babysat my brother and I, but I was like just totally in love with my grandmother. And, my grandmother was my best friend. When people used to ask me when I was like 10 and 11, who's your best friend? And I had girlfriends that were my age, but I would always tell them my grandmother is my best friend. I used to talk to her all the time. And when my mother got remarried and moved us to live with my stepfather in a different part of the city, and we were no longer living around the corner from my grandmother, I was traumatized. And I used to try and get back and live with my grandmother whenever I could. So, if you've listened to any of my stories, you'll know what I'm talking about, for those of you if this is the first time you're hearing it. So by the time I was 15 and a half years old, I realized that both my parents were not good parents. And I pushed to live with my maternal grandparents. And again, my grandmother was my best friend. I wanted to be around my grandmother, and she was always there for me when I was going through things with my mother. Excuse me, because at the time I kind of figured that there was something wrong with her, but 15 and a half, I didn't know anything about mental illness. I didn't know anything about emotional issues. But my grandmother had a lot more knowledge about why my mother acted the way that she did. But she understood. So she understood also my issues with my father. So long story short, I ended up living with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, when I was 16 years old. And I had to actually really fight my father for that. My mother was okay with it. I had a confrontation with my mother and my stepfather, and it was one of the last confrontations I had with them, because my stepfather had actually beat me up when I was 12 years old, and even before then, when the first year that my mother had married my stepfather, he had beat me and he had dislocated my arm. So that's a whole nother conversation on the physical violence that is allowed in the Jehovah Witness organization, because I hear about sexual abuse, but I don't hear a lot of conversation about the heavy hand and the physical violence towards children that goes on in the Jehovah Witness organization, but I can talk about it. I can talk about sort of how it's viewed, and the levity of what they do, and then how they don't give it the attention that's necessary. It's kind of like, oh well, get over it, shake it off, put on your this is just as an aside. My cousin and I were talking about uh, some inappropriate situations that had happened with her daughter. This is my cousin. And she had confronted our aunt. And my aunt said, well, put on your big girl panties and get over it. And she's a Jehovah Witness, and she was raised a Jehovah Witness. And that's kind of the mentality that a lot of witnesses have well, can you walk? You weren't in the hospital. So, and I was hospitalized the first time that my stepfather beat me when I was 9 years old and dislocated my arm. I was actually rushed to the emergency, and they had to do a procedure to get my arm back in the socket. But where was the understanding? Where was the sympathy? My grandparents were upset, but upset to what point? It's kind of like, they're your parents. You have to honor and respect them. And, and they'll tell them, don't do that again to your children. You know what I mean? So it's not calling Child Protective Services. It's not, doing something that needs to be done, calling authorities, getting them into social services to talk about why you're physically abusing your children. And that's literally what it was. And it took me a long time to actually come to terms with some of the things that happened. So by the time I was 15 and a half, I had literally had enough, because my father had also been physically abusive to me, and he had been physically abusive to my mother and my stepmother. And I had seen it. So I was done, and I just wanted to be happy, and I wanted to live in a peaceful household. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and my maternal grandfather opened their house up with open arms. And I loved it. My grandmother was my best friend. We had a great relationship. And when I think about it now, as naive as it sounds, I never thought that anything would ever happen to change that relationship. I just, I couldn't imagine what could ever happen, because love in the Jehovah Witness organization, even if it's family, is conditional. But I was raised that love is unconditional. And it's really, really odd when you think about it, but my concept of love was unconditional love. It wasn't conditioned on, you have to believe what I believe. So I had a different view of the way that I lived my life, even when I was 16 years old, because I was going out and learning things outside of Jehovah Witness organization. And one of the videos that I did, and again, if you need reference, I talk about when I worked at Sears and how that impacted my decision to be a Jehovah Witness. But as I've said throughout my conversations and my video logs, it's not one thing that happens and you decide to leave. It's an ongoing coming to that realization that this is not for me. And that's actually what happened to me. There was things that had happened for many years, different doctrines, different sermons I had listened to that I didn't agree with. I never agreed with the way that they viewed women. I never agreed with the way they viewed homosexuality. I never agreed with the way that they did the blood doctrine. But I used to tell myself, I don't agree with these things, but overall, generally, I believe that this is the best religion to be in. And I think that's what a lot of people tell themselves. And then I talked about the fear of Armageddon. So over time, I started to realize that there was actually many other things that concerned me about this organization, things that I saw with the difference in the way that the discipline was being done. People would commit quote unquote fornication and adultery and not be disfellowshipped, depending on the elders that were a part of it, depending on who was, in the in group. I had a problem with the way that people that I knew that had been disfellowshipped for inappropriate behavior with young people, and that was a real big trigger for me, and seeing that they were still allowed to be around young people in the congregation when they got reinstated. And that was when I realized that this disfellowshipping and reinstatement by unqualified, uneducated people without involving authorities or people that are actually trained to deal with these things is an imperfect discipline, because you're not alerting the members. And this was, and I saw this when I was living with my grandmother, because my grandfather was a presiding overseer, and my grandmother would share different things with me about people that were getting in trouble and things that I was seeing. I was like, I actually have some bigger problems than just some of the doctrine that I don't agree with. There's more things going on here that are really bothering me. And I decided I didn't want to go to the Kingdom Hall anymore. And I decided I didn't want to be a witness. And at the time that I was making that decision, I realized that I was going to have to change my life. And I had been injured when I was 12 years old. And because of that injury, my mother sued, and I was able to get this very large cash settlement. And I was looking at this cash settlement as a way for me to start over and to live life on my own terms. And one of the things that I was going to do was I was going to leave the religion. But I got to a point where I was like, I'm actually not going to go to the Kingdom Hall anymore. And my grandmother and grandfather kept asking me, because I was working at the time. So a lot of times I would use work as an excuse. But then it became when I wasn't working, and they're like, why are you not getting dressed and going to the Kingdom Hall? And I was like, I actually don't want to go. And they were like, what? What do you mean you don't want to go? And I'm like, I'm not going. I don't feel good. So after I kept saying I didn't feel good, my grandmother confronts me, because they were also having studies at their house on Saturday, and I was not going to that. And my grandmother is like, look, what is going on? Why are you not going out in field service? Why are you not going to the Kingdom Hall? Your grandfather is a presiding overseer and you live here. What are you doing? And I was like, listen, I've actually made a decision that I don't agree with this religion. And I never forget that conversation, because my grandmother looked at me like I had said that I was an alien. She was like, what are you talking about? You don't want to go to the Kingdom Hall. Are you saying you don't want to serve Jehovah? Do you want to be destroyed? Are you kidding me? And I was like, actually, Grandma, I'm like, you remember you told me your life story, and you told me how you were a Christian, and then when you were, in your teens, late teens or whatever, you had started studying and you decided that you kind of like this new belief. I was like, well, I'm a lot like you. Like, I was raised in this religion. However, I'm on the other side of it, meaning I want to learn about other belief systems. I don't think this is the one for me. And she was like, oh my goodness, it's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. Are you serious? Like, how can, this is the truth. There is nothing else. There's nothing else. And she was like, okay, we'll talk later. So I didn't think I'm like, I'm asserting myself as a free and independent thinker that I don't want to actually, believe what they believe. And, here's the naivety of me. I thought my grandparents loved me. Okay. They spoiled the crap out of me. And I was just really under this illusion that they may get upset about it, but they weren't going to push it. So the first thing that happened is when I got home from work, my father was at the house. And I was like, why is my father here? So my grandmother had called my father. My grandfather and my father, who actually wasn't even a Jehovah Witness at the time, but he was still a sympathizer. He still, was going to the meetings here and there. They confronted me. And my grandmother said, sit on the couch. And I was like, okay. And she said, we want to talk about what you told me. And I was like, oh, about me saying I don't want to go to the Kingdom Hall. And my father was like, yes, what is going on here? We know what's going on. We know that you have friends that you're hanging out with from school that are not Jehovah Witnesses, and you know that you should not be doing that. What kind of nonsense are they filling your head with? And I'm sitting there like, what the heck is going on here? So it was the first time that I was interrogated because of my beliefs. And my grandmother and my father did it. It was really interesting as my grandfather was sitting in the other room, but he did not get involved with that. And I remember that very clearly. But it was the first time that I actually asserted myself. And I was very adamant about the issues that I had with this organization. And this was a long time ago. This is before YouTube. This is before internet. I'm not that old. I'm not 50 or anything, but there was the internet, but most people didn't have it, didn't access it or anything. And this was before there was the EXJW organization. I was just a very philosophical and thorough person. And I stood my ground, and I didn't my grandmother thought all I needed was my father to be there, because my father is a bully. He has a very aggressive personality. And my grandmother was under this idea that that they were going to tell me this stuff and that I was going to not be a witness. It didn't happen. In fact, my grandmother was stunned at all of the different things that I was able to articulate very intelligently that I had problems with about the doctrine. And I even surprised myself. And they had no rebuttal, because all of the things that I brought up, all of the things that had changed even then, all of the different experiences I had had, my grandmother just had one statement: faith and waiting on Jehovah. And I'm like, but let's talk about the real issues here. I'm like, Grandma, do you really believe that you're secondary to a man? Do you really believe that? And she was like, Jehovah's going to fix it all. Jehovah's going to fix it all. But I'm like, but anybody in any organization can say that when you talk about the imperfection of their organization. When I talked about certain, that's not the organization. That's people in the organization that are incorrectly, interpreting the teachings. And I'm like, but people can say that about any organization that we as Jehovah Witnesses attack. When you look at the beliefs of any organization, the beliefs are the perfect idealized portion of their beliefs. And then people interpret it the way that they want. But most beliefs, when you study world religion, and I'm so glad that I did, but at 17 years old, I was just going off of my own observations, and I was giving, different situations that I had been in. So finally, my father was like, I can't stay here all night arguing with you. I just want you to think long and hard about what it is that you're doing, because if you go this route, you're going to lose your family. And I was like, I know. And my dad left, and he looked at my grandmother and he was like, I did the best I could. And I was like, can I go eat now? And my grandmother was like, go ahead. So I went to the kitchen, and my grandmother, she sat there for a while. She called my aunts, because that's kind of my grandmother's MO. She's gonna like try to destroy your credibility with other family members. My mom is kind of do stuff like that too. Like, you're not gonna believe what, my nickname said. And they're like, what? Da, da, da. So then my grandmother comes into the kitchen, and she's like, I know. And my grandmother, she's real good at trying to make you feel guilty. If you watch the Golden Girls, my grandmother and I used to watch the Golden Girls together all the time. And if you know Sophia Petrillo and how she would try and make Dorothy feel guilty about stuff, that was my grandmother. So my grandmother held her chest, and she was like, you didn't really mean what you said. I know you didn't mean what you said when you said you didn't want to be you didn't mean that. And I looked at her face, and my grandmother wasn't a big crier. She wasn't a big emotional person, but I saw her tearing up. And I had this like enlightenment, this like moment of clarity that my grandmother really, really felt that me not wanting to be a witness was affecting my relationship with her. Like my love for her, like me saying that I didn't want to be a witness meant I was saying I didn't love my grandmother. And it was the first time that I actually realized that she really, really felt like the two were that closely aligned. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So, I was adamant, though. I wasn't going to change my mind, but I put this little plan in place. I started writing letters to all my family members. I was calculating when I was going to get this money. And I actually got the money when I was 17 and a half years old, before I graduated from high school. So it was probably about 3 or 4 months before I graduated from high school. So I didn't get all the money. I got probably 75% of it. No, 65% of it I got straight out. And then 35% of it I put in a trust for me and my mother. So I couldn't get that money without my mother's approval. And that was one of the things that I'm glad I did, because I probably would have spent that money in all of a year. But I got the money, and I was having a ball. I went out with my cousin, and we went clothes shopping, pocketbook shopping. I was just having a blast. And the relationship between my grandmother and I had totally changed when I was very adamant about not wanting to be a witness. So basically, my grandfather said, please try to go to one meeting a week. And that was literally all he said. And because that's all my grandfather said, I did that. I didn't go every week, but I did enough so that they would kind of leave me alone. That I didn't go to the meeting where you give talks. I didn't go out in field service. I did enough because I understood that I didn't want my grandfather I didn't want his position to be affected by me not going to the Kingdom Hall. And that was another side conversation that my grandmother had. Like, listen, we get it. She's like, you're going to do what you're going to do, but you have to understand that what you do affects Grandpa. And, I love my grandfather. I'm going to talk a little bit. This is actually going to be a little bit longer than I expected, but it's a Saturday morning. I got the house to myself. Hubby's going out. He's in an educational conference. And so I thought it would be a great time for me to kind of do this. My honorary children are with their grandmother. So I'm like, let me kind of get this out. So this is more of a story and more of I'm sort of taking you, this is my narrative of what my grandmother's relationship meant to me and what we went through, because it's very significant. And I really am telling this. I really want it to, I hope that it means something to other people, because again, my grandmother's not here anymore. I had to make peace with the things that happened, and this is sort of the process of me going through that. So my grandmother said, listen, I get that you don't want to be a witness, but you're living here and grandpa is a presiding overseer. So let's find a happy medium here. And I hope that while you're here, you hear us, that you kind of change your mind. I was on another whole thing. I was not really going to the Kingdom Hall. I did not want to be a witness. I had told them directly I didn't want to be a witness. And they were hoping that I would change my mind. I was planning my exit. My goal was to graduate from high school, to get an apartment with my boyfriend or one of my best girlfriends, go to college, and cut ties with everybody. And that was my plan. But what happened is that the relationship, the closeness, my best friend grandmom, I followed her everywhere, totally changed. Even though I lived in a household, when she realized I didn't want to be a Jehovah Witness, she gave me a lot more grief. She just was different. And I kind of knew, intellectually that was going to happen. But seeing her behavior change towards me was sort of shocking. And she was just much more critical of me, much more making snide comments when I did things, which had never been, for 16 plus years of my life, had never been a part of the relationship with my grandmother. But it was kind of like, oh, you don't want to be a witness, then you're sort of enemy number one in this household. We don't trust you. We don't know what you're doing because you don't want to be a witness. And actually nothing had changed. I had just in myself felt that they loved me enough that I could say, I don't want to be a witness. I'm not bringing people into the house. We're not doing drugs. I'm not having sex in the house or anything like that. But I just don't want to be a witness. And it was shocking for me. And I remember one of my aunts was like, why would you say that to her? Like, even if that's if you believe, why would you tell them that while you're still in high school and you're still living with them? Like, wait until you leave and then tell them, because you're just making your time with them difficult. And, again, hindsight's 2020. Sure, I should have played along and then exited on my own. And I want to do, from my, tried and true own experiences, I do want to talk and do like a total video on the proper way to exit this organization. But, my life was trial by fire. I did things the hard way. Some of it because I was, kind of the first person that was doing this. And, my situation was significant. I lived with my grandparents. So when I got the money and I was going out and I was, hanging out with my cousin and buying stuff, my grandmother and my grandfather, we were having dinner and they were just looking at all. I had bought in a lot of jewelry. I got clothes. And my grandfather looked at me and he was like, well, the only thing I want is a radio. I want a TV. I want one of those portable TVs. And my grandmother looked at me and she was like, and all I want is some shoes. I want you to buy me some shoes. And so, my grandmother and I, like I said, our relationship had been really strained. So I'm like, well, I plan to get everybody things, but in my own time, like, don't sit there and try and demand stuff from me. Like, I'm going to do it. So she was like, but I see you going out with your cousin, buying her all those clothes and stuff. And like I said, all I want is some shoes. I mean, this is my house. This is our house. And we let you stay here. So again, at that time, and I talked about this in another video, I don't know about the whole child support thing. I'm going to guess that my father was giving child support to my mother. But until I was 18 years old, or while I was living with my grandparents, my father used to come by every week and drop off $100 to give to my grandparents. But that was it. But when my grandmother made that really snide remark to me, I was like, well, I don't have to give you nothing. I don't have to give you Nathan if you're going to act any kind of a way. I was just being, stubborn. I just didn't like that my grandmother was kind of being like, I'm your granddaughter, like we had this great loving relationship. And all of a sudden you're sort of being nasty to me because I don't want to go to the Kingdom Hall. And so, all this loving stuff, like, when I decided I didn't want, my grandmother had told me when I was 16 and I had moved in that she was going to throw me this big graduation party with people in the Kingdom Hall and my family. But she informed me, when I said, I don't want to go to the Kingdom Hall, she was like, well, you know what? You're not getting anything. Don't even think that you're getting anything when you graduate. And I was like, okay. But, deep down inside, it did kind of hurt that my grandmother didn't even end up going to my graduation. I mean, like I said, we weren't battling, but I love my grandmother so much, and we kind of have the same sort of quirky, smart mouth. So we were kind of like just having snide conversation with each other. But the reason why I left and the reason why my grandmother attacked me when I was 17 years old, and this is before I got this fellowship for not wanting to be a witness, is that my cousin had come over, and this is the cousin that I'm still close to this day, and she had come to visit me, and my uncle, my grandmother's only son, was there as well. Now, my cousin had come upstairs, but she went downstairs too. And long story short, she said that she overheard my uncle talking to my grandmother about me being there. So this conversation happened after I graduated from high school. So here's some things that I found out the hard way. I had a lot of money. I had enough money that I could have put a down payment on a house. I could have gotten a car. I had enough money to pay up an apartment for several years and still have a lot of money left over. So I actually learned the hard way that no one would rent to a 17-and-a-half-year-old kid. I thought all I needed was money, and they would not rent to me without a cosigner. The only people that I knew were people in the Kingdom Hall and people that were my family members. Now, I did know some adults that I had met working at Sears, but none of them were close enough to me to say that they were going to co-sign for me. So I had hit a roadblock because honestly, I was really, once I graduated, I was ready to leave the next week. But when I started looking at apartments with my friends and my boyfriend, none of us are 18 years old. That's when I got the harsh, reality that I don't know what I'm going to do because I got all this money, but I'm still too young to get an apartment. So I was still working at Sears at that time. So I was in a bad situation where I was still living with my grandparents. I could not just go out and get an apartment without a co-signer at 17 and a half years old. So I was literally just trying to brainstorm, talk to friends that I knew from school, see if one of their parents would sign for me. And one of my best girlfriends, her mom was actually considering it. All she wanted was like a payment. And I told my friend, like, let's meet with her and I will pay her. Like, I will pay her money for her to co-sign. So she was actually considering it. So I was actually trying to find an apartment, get her to come with me, and get her to co-sign for me. So what happened is that my My cousin told me the conversation that she overheard my grandmother having with my uncle. And my grandmother was really just degrading me, saying, yeah, she's here. No, she still hasn't given me any money. All I did was ask her for shoes, and she don't want to go to the Kingdom Hall. Like, my grandmother was just like totally like disrespecting me. And I was just like, this is not, nah, my headspace was, I got money. I'm ready to hang out with my friends and boyfriend. I'm done with this whole scene. I was just in a different headspace. So I was like, maybe this is a catalyst that I need. So my uncle left and my grandmother came upstairs and she was like, what's wrong with you? I was like, Grandma, how could you say all that stuff to my uncle? Like, what's wrong with you? She was like, I told you that you out here spending all this money. You can't even give me money for shoes. I was like, are you really still talking about that? Like, of course I'm going to give you money. I'm going to give my mom money. I'm going to give everybody money. You know, I'm like, I've already written out how much I need to go to the bank and get. You know, this is before ATMs and all that kind of stuff. So my grandmother was like, I want to know what you're doing with that money. And we got into a bit of a back and forth. And she's like, then she said, sorry, I had to have some tea. Throat's getting a little dry. Excuse me. Then she said, why aren't you going to the Kingdom Hall? Why don't you come back to Jehovah? And I was like, okay, I'm out. You know what, Grandma? I love you. I love you. I thank you so much for everything that you and Grandpop have done, but I need to go. And she's like, what? I said, I need to go. I don't want to, I've told you, I don't want to go to the Kingdom Hall. I really need to find myself. She's like, where are you going to go? I was like, I don't know. By this time, my grandfather comes into the middle room and he's like, what's going on? And she's like, she done lost her mind. She done lost her mind. And my grandmother jumps up, and like I said, I'm very tall. My grandmother is very short. And she jumps up and she starts pummeling me all over my face. And she's like, where are you going? The world's not going to love you. You're leaving Jehovah. And she just starts hitting me all over my face. And I mean, it didn't really hurt. She just, and I just grabbed her arms and pushed her off of me. And I was like, and my grandfather was like, he called my grandmother by her name and said, stop. What are you doing? She got to live her own life. You can't stop her from doing that. And my grandfather looked at me and he was like, we'll always love you. And my grandmother was like, she snapped out of it. But I never forget her saying, the world isn't going to love you. How are you going to leave? Go out in the world. See how they treat you. They're going to chew you up and spit you out. I was looking at her. Oh, you mean like people in Kingdom Hall do to people? Like you're talking to someone who has actually been a witness their whole life. You're not talking to somebody out in field service. I know all the dirty secrets. I know where all the bodies are buried. So you can't tell me, that kind of, it doesn't happen in a congregation. No, scandals happen in a congregation all the time. So I left and my cousin came with me, and I eventually got this fellowship because the brothers found out that I had been dating someone, and my aunt forced me to go and tell them in a judicial meeting. They were not going to disfellowship me. They told me. They just want me to come back to the Kingdom Hall. The person that was the head of the judicial committee was my grandfather's best friend. And he told me, we can put you on reproof. We can put you on private reproof. We're looking at your record, your service record And again, for people, this is a company, it's a business company. Why would they have a service record if it wasn't a company? But anyway, he's like, we're looking at your record, we're looking at your service, we're looking at your hours of service, and you give wonderful talks. The kids in Kingdom Hall look up to you. We miss you. Can you come back to the Kingdom Hall? And then he, tells me that my grandfather has said that, I've had some doubts, and he's like, there's some strong sisters in the Kingdom Hall that can work with you, if you don't want to study with your grandmother. And that's when, I was like, at first I was like, if they're not going to disfellowship me, then I'll just kind of, play this whole judicial thing off and fade off. I mean, that's honestly what I had in my mind. Like, if they're not going to do that and I just listen to what they say, put me on reproof, and nobody will know anything. And then when you tell me you put me on reproof, then I'm just not going to come back to the Kingdom Hall, and I'll just fade off. In fact, that's actually how I saw it. But they were like, we want you to come back to the Kingdom Hall. We want to have a few more meetings with you. And that is when, I just wasn't trying to have another judicial meeting. I wasn't trying to meet with them regularly. They were talking about have regular meetings with them. I felt that the whole judicial process was very invasive, and I felt attacked. I felt like some of the questions that they asked were inappropriate. I'd never actually been in a situation like that, so I felt that they were asking very prying, intimate questions like they were detectives. And I'm like, two of the people that are elders got their GEDs. Like, how are you acting like you're a freaking detective and I'm on trial for something and I don't have representation here? It's just me, a 17-and-a-half-year-old kid, meeting with you. And I didn't agree with that. I didn't agree with not having a parent there. I didn't agree. You know what I mean? I just felt like I didn't like the setup. So I wasn't willing to come back. They wanted me to commit to going to a congregation if I didn't want to go to that one. And so long story short, I just stopped interacting with them, and they disfellowshipped me. And my grandmother, she called me. I think she called me, or I came over, and she was like, they weren't going to disfellowship you. Why didn't you just come back to the Kingdom Hall? And I was like, because you knew I didn't want to be a witness. And I'm like, they disfellowship me because they know I didn't want to be a witness. They disfellowship me for that. And I'm not going to be a part of an organization that excommunicates me or anyone else because of a difference in opinion. I should be able to, this like joining any group, and then because you don't want to be a member, that everybody else now refuses to acknowledge you, and you're now a bad person simply for asserting your right to have your own life and your opinion. That's not right. So I'm sharing that my grandmother had a conversation with me because I still did talk to my grandmother. I still did talk to my grandparents. I was mad at my grandmother for a minute, but again, I love my grandmother. We had a tiff, we had a disagreement. I left the house. I never came back. I visited. I had my own life and path, ups and downs, but I still talk to my grandmother occasionally. I was not involved in the family on a regular basis, but I would call my grandmother. I would visit my grandparents when I could. And my grandmother would call me. She would give me updates on the family. And, that's kind of how it was for many years. And, she was hurt that I was no longer a witness. She would, repeatedly, when she could, do her little, I want you to come back to Jehovah before I pass on. And I'm like, I think you're going to have to let that one go. I think you're going to have to let that one go. So what changed? What what sort of brought my grandmother and our relationships full circle. So, if you listen to the video that I did about my pedophile grandfather, excuse me, things actually changed when my grandfather passed away. My maternal grandfather was the first person to pass away in my family. And I hadn't been to the Kingdom Hall since I had left. And that had been my first time going back to the Kingdom Hall. I'd seen a lot of my family at my grandfather's funeral. By that time, I had graduated from college. I graduated from undergrad. I already had 2 degrees, and I had studied quite a bit about human behavior and psychology, and started to realize that my grandfather was a sexual predator, but I had never told anybody. After the funeral, my aunt and my cousin came to visit me. They came like 3 states. They drove down on a Sunday, and they had a visit with me out of the blue. And that is when they shared all these things about my grandfather that absolutely devastated me. At the time that they shared this information, my mother was actually still alive. And my mother had actually been sent back to, I guess they call it 302, depending on where you live. My mother had actually been on a psychiatric ward a little bit after my grandfather died. She had tried to commit suicide. And she had been in and out of psychiatric wards and had been diagnosed as schizoaffective, schizodefective, bipolar. My mother's had multiple diagnoses over the years, but let's just say my mother was severely mentally ill. She was on a lot of medicine. But after my grandfather died, she had tried to commit suicide, and she was in a psychiatric hospital. And I called my mother, and I had asked her why she had swallowed all these pills, and she said she had a dream that my grandfather had come to her in the night, and she was scared. So again, by that time, I was piecing together things that my mother had said to me over the years, and there was a theme that had to do with sexuality, sex, repression, abuse. And I realized that there was something that had happened to my mother that no one was talking about. Because a lot of times when you see people that have the types of behaviors that my mother had, and this is really for women, although it can happen to men, but more times with women, and you see this type of mental illness, there is almost 9 times out of 10, some type of sexual trauma that has happened to the person. And again, I'm studied now. I'm educated now. I am aware of things that I was never aware of when I was young. So when my cousin and my aunt confirmed the things that they did, my aunt talked about her abuse, not just sexual abuse, but physical abuse that happened to my grandfather, that happened at the hands of my grandfather, and what he had done. I was devastated, and I was so angry at my grandmother. I was so angry at my grandmother because my aunt told me that my grandmother knew. And that just brought up a lot of things. We had a peaceful resolution through the years when I was 17 onward. But then when I found out that all this stuff had happened, again, I'm so glad that I can talk about these things with my cousin, but we talk about my mom and another aunt. And my other aunt has had a lot of mental issues as well. And she's had a lot of drama in my grandparents' house as well. A lot of tragedy has gone on. I've talked honestly about the fact that my family has had a lot of dysfunction because of my grandfather and his sexual abuse of his children. And it's a secret that nobody wants to talk about. And the problem is that, and the other part of it was I was actually kind of angry at my aunts and my uncle because they knew that my grandfather has sexually abused them. My youngest aunt, I don't think that anything ever happened to her, but she knew about it. She knew about it because my cousin told me that my youngest aunt would hold it over my grandfather's head. Like, I know this stuff. So if you continue down this road, I'm going to tell the brothers about what I know. She told me that she came across my aunt like confronting my grandfather about that. But my problem is that for the context of my life and growing up, my aunts and my uncle, now my uncle had a different situation, my grandfather. They weren't always cool, but for the context of my growing up, my grandfather was put on a pedestal to the grandkids and to everybody in the Kingdom Hall, like boasting my grandfather, my father is a presiding overseer, da, da, da. And I'm like, what a mind, you know what? Like, this is not the truth. This is not the truth. This is not this great honorable man. This is a man that was raping his children. This is a man, my grandfather molested me. And I want to talk about that because I repressed this memory until I could articulate it fully. And it was after I was like in deep thought and I remembered what happened to me. So what happened to me is that my grandfather, when I was about 4 years old, used to sit me on his lap and he used to have me massaging his penis through his clothes. And he was doing that and my grandmother walked up on it and she freaked out because my grandparents used to actually watch me when I was young. And she freaked out. She grabbed me from my grandfather. She told my grandfather off. She told me not to be around my grandfather. And my mother, before my mother came home, my grandmother said, and we're not going to say anything to your mom. Put it out of your head. I've handled grandpop. That's not going to happen again. And it never did. And the thing that was hard for me coming to terms with what happened to me is that my grandfather was this loving grandfather to me. He gave me whatever I wanted. He never touched me after that. I never had any situation where he did anything that was inappropriate, but I knew, like in my mind, I remember being around him a few times and having a very uncomfortable feeling that I could not articulate. You know what I mean? Like, so when this all came out and I was having a heart-to-heart with my aunt, and because I talked to my aunt a few times after she told me all this information, and I told her what I finally remembered, and it was like, it was so deep. I know I'm doing this on YouTube, and some of it is just me sort of being honest about what has happened to a lot of people in the Jehovah Witness organization, because I told my cousin, like, I really honestly believe that a lot of people in my family would be like my aunt was when my cousin was talking about an inappropriate behavior that had happened to her. Well, he didn't have sex with you. Well, he didn't touch you. So put on your big girl panties and get over it. You know what I mean? That's what is happening in the Jehovah Witness organization when it comes to young girls and being mistreated and being molested and being abused and being violated by men that are older and have positions of authority, is that we are not respected, we're not heard. Our dehumanization and our abuse is not taken seriously because it's like they're grading it, they're putting it on a scale. Like, so he made inappropriate comments to you, so what? He didn't throw you down. It's like, and I think people do that because they have been indoctrinated incorrectly in an organization that diminishes the rights of women. And I had to make sure that I put that out there. I was devastated. And when I talked about my aunt and my mother and how there is this sort of cloud of looking down at them because they have mental illness, but not actually having compassion for them because you don't want to talk about the cause of the mental illness. You want to judge people because they reacted to the abuse that they had. But you think that you are going to be blessed by the universe. And you think that you're representing a loving organization and that you're actually coming from a loving place, but you're a very judgmental, non-compassionate, unloving person. And no matter what title you have, if you don't have compassion for your fellow human being, for the victimization that they have experienced, you can't preach to me that you're coming from the right place. You can't, because you're actually talking to an elevated person. You're actually talking to a person that is evolved and a person that is aware. And I don't care about what title or organization you're a part of. If you don't have love and compassion for your fellow human beings, you are lost. And it's been amazing for me to come full circle. But I understood the aunt that doesn't talk to anybody, that had crisis in herself, that cut herself off from the family, that doesn't talk to my grandmother, that had issues with my grandfather. I get it, because the dirty secret is that she lived in a family where her father was abusing her, where her father was sexually assaulting her, and her mother was not doing enough or didn't stop it, didn't go to authorities. My grandmother never went to the authorities. She never turned my grandfather in to anybody in the Kingdom Hall. And why? It wasn't because my grandmother was a bad person. And this is real talk. And this is part of my journey of forgiveness. My grandmother was a person who was devoted to anything that she was a part of. And my grandmother had been indoctrinated by an organization that told her that if there were not two witnesses, then there would be no legitimate claim. My grandmother was indoctrinated by an organization that said that her as a woman is lower than the ranking of a man. And she knew that she would not be in a good place if she tried to turn her high-ranking husband in, and that she would have to make a choice on her life, her children's life, and her own way of taking care of herself. And I don't blame my grandmother for that. I don't. I understood it. And I had to understand it. I had to understand why she did the things that she did to me. I had to find a place of forgiveness, but it was not easy. It was not easy for me to do because I was so hurt. I had to understand that my grandmother was this regimented woman. She was this person who, and like I said, my grandmother and I are very much alike because I'm the same way. I don't do things halfway. If I join an organization, I'm all in. I'm going to follow the rules to the letter. And that's what my grandmother did. It wasn't because she didn't love her children. It wasn't because she was dropping the ball. She had been indoctrinated by a group, and I hold this group accountable. Because you take people like my grandmother, a poor colored girl from the South who didn't have a lot of opportunities in the society that she was in, and you duped her. You duped her into thinking that she was going to be elevated in this organization. And in fact, you suppressed her speech. You suppressed her right to protect her children. And that is one of the reasons I wanted to do this video. So when my grandmother passed on and my cousin called me and we talked about the fact that my grandmother, because my grandfather had messed up in his life, that they needed the grandchildren to help with the funeral costs, I did it without question. I told myself I wasn't going to cry, but if you got your little tears, let's all just get it out. I did it without question because I had forgiven my grandmother. And I thought about the last conversation that I had with her. And the only thing that I could remember was the love. And I put everything else in the universe. My mom is at peace. My brother is at peace. But I'm here. And while I'm here, my grandmother's legacy lives on through me. And no one can touch that. And I will tell the story. I will tell my story. And I will continue to advocate for women and children that have been sexually abused by predators in the Jehovah Witness organization. And I will forgive my grandmother because they took away her right to advocate for her children. And I will love her. And I will love her. And I will love her. Because love is stronger than any of these things. And I will continue to advocate that this organization is held accountable for the things that they have done to victims of sexual and child abuse. With that, I'm going to thank you for listening. I want you to have a blessed day and continue the struggle, continue the fight, and remember that you are doing the right thing.